They say the jungle doesn't whisper, it screams. But what if the only thing standing between you and a painful death wasn't a doctor, wasn't a hospital, but a 400-pound silverback gorilla? Welcome back to Bioconfession. I'm glad you're here because today we are opening a case file from the deep Congo rainforest that honestly keeps me up at night. It starts as a typical survival story, but it turns into one of the most fascinating examples of biological intelligence ever recorded. We're going to look at how an animal's instinct solved a medical crisis that would have baffled human science. Now, before we get lost in the woods, do me a quick favor. If you love exploring the dark corners of biology and medical mysteries, hit that subscribe button right now. Join the Bioconfession community. We investigate the stories that textbooks are too afraid to tell. Are you ready? Because this story gets toxic very fast. Pay close attention. Here is what happened. It had been 72 hours since the group last saw the sky. In the deep Congo, you don't really get sunlight. You get a thick, green twilight that never ends. They were 3 days off course, separated from their guide during a sudden torrential downpour that turned the terrain into a mudslide. The humidity was sitting at nearly 100%, making every breath feel like they were inhaling warm soup. They were effectively drowning in open air. Their supplies were completely gone. The last drop of filtered water had been shared between 4 grown men 12 hours prior. Now the physical toll was setting in. Their tongues felt like sandpaper, and their vision was starting to swim at the edges. They were no longer walking with purpose. They were stumbling, driven only by the primal fear that if they stopped moving, the vegetation would simply grow over them and erase their existence. The psychological weight was heavier than the physical one. The jungle is loud-filled with insects, birds, and wind, but when you are lost, it feels silent. It feels like the trees are holding their breath, waiting for you to fall. Mark, the cameraman, was taking it the hardest. He had stopped talking hours ago, his eyes darting around wildly, scanning the dense foliage for threats that weren't there. Now, I need you to pause and understand something here, because movies have lied to you about survival. When we think of death in the jungle, we imagine jaguars, snakes, or venomous spiders. We imagine a violent, bloody struggle, but that is rarely how it happens. Biological death in these environments is much slower and much quieter. The real killer is thermal regulation and dehydration. In the Congo, you sweat out liters of water just by standing still. Your blood thickens. Your heart has to pump sludge instead of liquid. Oxygen stops reaching the brain efficiently. This is the moment where logic shuts down and panic takes the steering wheel. That is the true predator, your own failing biology. Back on the ground, that panic was beginning to take hold. They checked the GPS for the 100th time, but the canopy was too thick to get a signal. They were walking in circles. The heat was relentless, a physical weight pressing down on their shoulders. Every step required a conscious effort of will. They were burning calories they didn't have, sweating out water they couldn't replace. Then, Mark collapsed. Not fully, but he stumbled hard against a mahogany tree, gasping for air. When the others looked at him, his face was a mask of red, flushed skin, but he wasn't sweating anymore. That's a critical sign of heat stroke called anhydrosis. His body had simply run out of fluid to cool itself down. They knew they had to find water immediately, or he wouldn't make it through the night. They tried to cut through a patch of vines to find a stream, but the jungle fought back. Thorny underbrush tore at their clothes and skin. The insects, sensing weakness, swarmed in clouds around their eyes and mouths. It was maddening. The relentless buzzing sound was starting to sound like voices, whispering things that didn't make sense to their exhausted minds. "I can see it," Mark mumbled, pointing at absolutely nothing. "There's a vending machine right there." He was hallucinating. The dehydration was now affecting his neurotransmitters. The team had to physically restrain him from running off into the bush toward a mirage. The group's morale shattered right there. They weren't a team of documentarians anymore. They were prey. Desperation is a dangerous chemical. It overrides millions of years of evolutionary caution. As the sun began to set, casting long, terrifying shadows across the forest floor, their stomachs cramped with hunger and thirst. They needed anything to put inside their bodies. And that is when the jungle offered them a test that they were about to fail miserably. Here is Chapter 2. I have expanded the descriptions and the scientific commentary to meet your request for 12 substantial paragraphs, maintaining the investigative, storytelling tone throughout. In the jungle, starvation changes you fundamentally. It's not just a feeling of emptiness in your stomach. It is a rewriting of your brain's operating system. After 72 hours without substantial food, the team was no longer looking at the forest with the eyes of explorers. They were looking at it with the desperate eyes of scavengers. Every shadow looked like shelter, and every colorful speck in the endless green looked like a meal. The complex cognitive functions that allow humans to assess risk and follow safety protocols were shutting down one by one, replaced by a singular, screaming biological imperative: consume calories at any cost. It creates a tunnel vision where the future doesn't exist, only the immediate need to stop the gnawing pain inside, and that is a dangerous state of mind. Suddenly, amidst the tangled vines and rotting logs, Mark froze. His eyes locked onto a cluster of low-hanging branches about 20 yards off the path they were trying to forge. Hanging there, like forbidden ornaments, were fruits. They were roughly the size of a grapefruit, with a smooth, waxy skin that transitioned from a deep, inviting purple to a vibrant sunset orange. In a monochromatic world of green leaves and brown mud, this burst of color was hypnotic. To a starving man, it didn't look like a biological warning sign. It looked like a miracle sent from the heavens. Mark stumbled toward the bush, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline that was entirely focused on that strange hanging prize. Now I need you to understand exactly why this moment is so terrifying from a biological perspective. In nature, plants and animals are locked in an eternal arms race. Plants cannot run away from predators, so they evolve chemical warfare. Often, they use bright, vivid colors known as aposematism to signal to herbivores that they are toxic, bitter, or deadly. It is nature's way of saying stay away, but to the human brain, especially the modern human brain conditioned by grocery stores where bright red apples are sweet and safe, color equals ripeness. We are evolutionarily wired to seek out these vibrant colors because, for our primate ancestors, they usually meant high sugar content. Mark was about to fall victim to an evolutionary trap that has existed for millions of years. The team's guide, had he been there, would have slapped Mark's hand away instantly. He would have recognized the subtle cues that screamed danger, the waxy sheen of the skin, the lack of insect bites on the fruit, and the specific shape of the leaves. In the wild, if insects who have been evolving alongside these plants for eons are avoiding a fruit, you should absolutely avoid it too. But the guide was gone, and the remaining members of the group were too weak to physically restrain him. They shouted weak protests, citing the survival manual's universal edibility test, a protocol that requires testing a plant on your skin and lips for hours before swallowing. But Mark wasn't listening to logic anymore. He was listening to his dying hunger. He reached out, his trembling hand grasping the heavy fruit. It felt firm and ripe, filled with liquid. He didn't bother to inspect it for parasites or smell it for the scent of almonds, which often indicates cyanide. He didn't slice it open to check the color of the sap. Instead, he tore into the skin with his teeth like a wild animal. The sound of the skin breaking was sickeningly loud in the quiet clearing. Juice, thick and sticky, ran down his chin, mixing with the grime and sweat on his face. He didn't just take a bite. He devoured it, driven by a frenzy that scared the other two men standing behind him. It was a scene of pure, unfiltered primal instinct taking control over reason. This is where the story gets complicated because, initially, nothing happened. In fact, Mark looked relieved. He described the taste as incredibly sweet, almost like a mix between a melon and a custard apple. And that is the most insidious part of plant toxicity. Many deadly toxins, especially those found in the tropics, are not bitter. Some plants have evolved to mask their poisons with high concentrations of fructose to trick animals into eating them. using the animal as a vessel to disperse seeds before the toxin kills them or makes them sick. A sweet taste in the wild is not a guarantee of safety. Sometimes it is simply the sugar coating on a chemical bullet. Mark wasn't eating a meal. He was loading a weapon pointed at his own nervous system. The other members of the group watched him with a mixture of horror and intense jealousy. This is a psychological phenomenon often seen in survival situations, even when you know something might be dangerous. Seeing someone else relieve their suffering makes you question your own safety standards. Their stomachs were cramping, their mouths were dry, and watching Mark gulp down the fruit made their own hunger flare up with renewed violence. They stepped closer, their resolve breaking. One of them actually reached out a hand, asking Mark to save a piece for him. It was a pivotal moment. If they had all eaten the fruit, the story would have likely ended right there with 3 corpses in the jungle. Fortunately, Mark was in a state of resource guarding. He turned his back on them, hunched over his prize, refusing to share. In his delirium, he growled at them to find their own food. That selfishness, born of starvation, ironically saved their lives. He finished the entire fruit, consuming the flesh, the juice, and even some of the smaller seeds, wiping his mouth with a dirty sleeve. He looked at them with a wide, manic grin, fueled by the sudden spike in blood sugar. "I feel better," he told them. "I feel like I can walk for another 10 miles. For a few minutes, it seemed like he was right. The sugar hit his bloodstream, and he stood up straighter, the color returning to his pale cheeks. But biology operates on a delay. While the sugar was being absorbed into his blood, providing that temporary energy, the complex alkaloids contained in the fruit's flesh were moving into his digestive tract. These chemical compounds were designed to disrupt cellular function. They were now beginning to break down in the stomach acid, preparing to cross the barrier into the bloodstream. It's like lighting a long fuse on dynamite. Everything looks calm and peaceful while the spark travels down the line, but the explosion is inevitable. Mark was walking, talking, and even laughing, completely unaware that he had just ingested a potent neurotoxin that was currently navigating toward his central nervous system. The group decided to keep moving, energized by Mark's sudden recovery. They thought perhaps they had been too cautious, too afraid. Maybe the jungle was providing for them after all. They walked for another hour as the light began to fade from the canopy above. The green twilight deepened into a heavy, suffocating gray. The air grew cooler, but the humidity remained, clinging to their skin. They found a small clearing to set up a makeshift camp for the night, believing the worst of their hunger was over for at least one of them. Mark sat down against a tree, closing his eyes, looking content for the first time in days. However, if you looked closely, you would have seen the first subtle signs that something was wrong. Mark was rubbing his fingertips against his pants over and over again. He mentioned casually that his hands felt fuzzy, like they were asleep. He shook his head vigorously, as if trying to clear water from his ears. He complained that the sounds of the jungle were becoming metallic, echoing strangely. These were the first tremors of the earthquake that was about to hit his body. The toxins were reaching the nerve endings, beginning to block the signals between his brain and his muscles. The sun finally vanished, plunging the Congo into absolute pitch darkness. The jungle came alive with the nocturnal chorus of millions of insects, a deafening wall of sound. But in the small circle of their camp, the silence was heavy. Mark had stopped talking. He was staring into the darkness, his pupils dilated to the point where his eyes looked entirely black. The sugar rush was gone. The fatal mistake had been made, and now the bill was coming due. The chemistry of the jungle was about to wage war on human biology, and the team was miles away from the nearest hospital. The nightmare was just beginning. The transition from stability to chaos didn't happen gradually. It arrived with the sudden violence of a car crash. For about 2 hours after eating the fruit, Mark had been quiet, curled up near the base of a massive kapok tree, seemingly asleep. The rest of the team was drifting in and out of consciousness, exhausted by the heat. Then, a sound pierced the silence of the jungle, a guttural, wet gasping noise that didn't sound human. It was the sound of air trying to force its way through a constricted throat. They shone their flashlights toward Mark, and what they saw froze their blood. He wasn't sleeping. He was arching his back off the ground in an impossible angle, his heels and the back of his head digging into the mud, his body locked in a rigid bow of agony. The team rushed to his side, but Mark was no longer present in the way we understand personhood. He was in the grip of a grand mal seizure, but it was far more violent than typical epilepsy. His limbs were thrashing with such force that when one of his friends tried to grab his arm, he was thrown back by the sheer kinetic energy. Mark's teeth were clamped shut, grinding together so hard that the sound of enamel cracking was audible over the chirping of crickets. This wasn't just a sickness. It was a total systemic hijacking. The cheerful energy from the sugar rush had evaporated, replaced by a nervous system that was firing every single weapon it had against itself. Suddenly, the thrashing stopped, replaced by a terrifying stiffness. Mark's eyes snapped open, but they weren't looking at his friends. The pupils were fully dilated, swallowing the iris completely, turning his eyes into two black voids that couldn't react to the flashlight beam. This phenomenon, known as mydriasis, indicated that his sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response, was maxed out, screaming at full volume. Veins on his neck and forehead bulged like thick blue cords, pulsing rapidly against his sweat-drenched skin. His heart was beating so fast it was visible through his torn shirt, a frantic drum trying to pump poison blood through a body that was rapidly shutting down. Then came the fluids. A thick, white foam began to bubble from the corners of his mouth, tinged with pink blood where he had bitten his tongue. He was drooling uncontrollably because the muscles required to swallow had been paralyzed. This is one of the most disturbing sights in medicine. A grown man drowning in his own secretions because the autonomic commands to clear his throat have been severed. The team turned him onto his side to prevent aspiration, wiping the foam away with dirty hands, begging him to breathe, but Mark could only make choking, gurgling noises. The terror in the campsite was absolute. They were watching their friend disintegrate biologically, and they didn't even have a bottle of water to help him. I need to stop the story here for a second to explain exactly what is happening inside Mark's body, because it is fascinating and terrifying. Most plant neurotoxins work by targeting the synaptic cleft, the tiny gap between your nerves and your muscles. Normally, your brain sends a chemical signal called acetylcholine to tell a muscle to move, and then an enzyme cleans it up to stop the movement. It's a perfect on-off switch. But the toxins found in certain jungle fruits often mimic these chemicals. They fit into the receptors like a duplicate key, jamming the lock open. Imagine if you turned on the light switch in your house, but instead of just lighting up, the bulb exploded with the power of a lightning bolt and refused to turn off. That is what was happening to every muscle fiber in Mark's body. The toxin was flooding his receptors, causing a cholinergic storm. His nerves were screaming, "Contract," without pause. This leads to the spasms, the rigid paralysis, and the excessive production of fluids like saliva and mucus. His body wasn't failing. It was overworking itself to death, trapped in a chemical feedback loop that he couldn't control. Back in the mud, the realization of their helplessness washed over the group. They tore through their empty backpacks, looking for anything, a forgotten antihistamine, a charcoal tablet, even a piece of bread to absorb the poison. They found nothing but camera batteries and lenses. This is the cruel reality of the wilderness. Technology is useless against biology. A $10,000 camera cannot filter toxins from the blood. They were stripping off their shirts to try and cool him down, as his body temperature was skyrocketing due to the constant muscle contractions, but the humid air offered no relief. Mark's condition shifted again. The violent shaking faded into a limp, flaccid paralysis. This was arguably scarier than the seizures. He lay there like a ragdoll, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. He was conscious, his eyes were darting around in panic, but he couldn't move a finger. He was trapped inside a concrete statue of his own flesh. The toxin had moved from the excitatory phase to the depressive phase, blocking the signals entirely. He was trying to scream, to ask for help, but his vocal cords were frozen. Only a faint wheeze escaped his lips. The friends sat around him in a circle, holding his hands, trying to offer comfort in a situation that was devoid of hope. They wiped the sweat from his forehead and whispered lies that help was coming, even though they knew it wasn't. The smell of the jungle rotting, vegetation and damp earth mixed with the metallic smell of blood and sickness. It was a sensory nightmare. Every rustle in the bushes made them jump, fearing that predators would be attracted to the sound of a dying animal. They were isolated, vulnerable, and watching the clock tick down on Mark's life. As the night deepened, Mark's breathing became shallow and irregular. This is the terminal stage of neurotoxic poisoning, respiratory failure. The diaphragm is a muscle, and like the legs and arms, it requires nerve signals to function. As the paralysis crept upward toward his chest, the simple act of expanding his lungs became a Herculean task. He was suffocating in open air, his chest barely rising. The group looked at each other with tears in their eyes, knowing that without a ventilator or an antidote, the physics of gas exchange would fail and Mark would be gone before sunrise. But the jungle is a place of duality. It holds the poison, but it often holds the cure if you know where to look. While the humans were focused on the tragedy unfolding in the mud, nature was continuing its cycle around them. High above in the canopy and deep in the brush, other eyes were watching. They weren't the eyes of a predator, but of a neighbor who had lived in this chemical warfare zone for millions of years. Something was moving towards them, something massive, bringing with it a twist that no medical textbook could predict. The silence was broken not by a death rattle, but by the heavy, deliberate snapping of branches. A massive shape detached itself from the shadows of the tree line. It wasn't the rescue team they prayed for. It was a beast. And in that moment, the group didn't know if their night was about to get better or if it was about to end in violence. Mark gasped for air, his eyes rolling back as the dark shape stepped into the moonlight. The focus of the group was entirely locked on the tragic rhythm of Mark's failing lungs. In a survival situation, your world shrinks down to the immediate crisis. The vast, dangerous jungle had momentarily ceased to exist, replaced by the small, muddy circle of light cast by their dying headlamps. They were so consumed by the effort of counting his breaths, 1, 2, pause, gasp, that they had stopped scanning the perimeter. It is a fatal error in the wild called situational blindness. When you are tending to the wounded, you become deaf to the environment. The forest, however, does not pause out of respect for human suffering. While they wept over their friend, the environment around them shifted from a passive backdrop into an active threat. The first warning wasn't a visual one. It was auditory. The relentless symphony of crickets and tree frogs, which had been a deafening wall of white noise for hours, suddenly cut out. It happened in a wave, a silence spreading through the canopy like a ripple in water. This phenomenon, known as the predator silence, occurs when prey animals sense an apex threat nearby. They freeze and go quiet to avoid detection. The sudden drop in decibels was jarring, louder than any scream. The survivors looked up from Mark's convulsing body, their eyes wide, realizing that the jungle was holding its breath. Something was coming, and the local residents were terrified of it. Then came the sound of destruction. It started about 50 yards out, the sharp, violent crack of dry wood snapping under immense weight. This wasn't the subtle rustle of a snake or the soft pawfall of a leopard stalking its dinner. This was something heavy, clumsy, and arrogant. It was the sound of a creature that didn't need to be stealthy because it had no natural enemies. Branches were being pushed aside or broken off entirely. The noise grew rhythmically louder. Crunch, snap, thud. It sounded like a bulldozer moving through the undergrowth, tearing the vegetation apart with brute force. I need you to understand the primal fear that hits the human brain in a moment like this. For millions of years, our ancestors were on the menu. We have a dormant circuit in our amygdala that lights up specifically when we hear large animals moving in the dark. It bypasses logic and goes straight to panic. The survivors were exhausted, dehydrated, and emotionally broken. But the adrenaline dump they received in that moment was massive. Their hearts hammered against their ribs. They were no longer worried about the heat or the thirst. They were worried about being torn apart. They grabbed whatever they could find, rotten sticks, a rock, a heavy camera lens, pitiful weapons against whatever was making that noise. The footsteps were getting closer, and they were heavy enough to be felt through the ground. With each thud, the mud beneath their feet vibrated slightly. This tactile sensation terrified them even more than the sound. In the Congo, only a few animals have the mass to generate ground tremors: forest elephants, buffalo, or massive primates. The group huddled closer to Mark, effectively using their own bodies as a human shield for their dying friend. It was a gesture of loyalty, but they knew it was futile. If this was a hungry leopard or an aggressive buffalo, 3 weakened men with sticks were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The visual barrier of the jungle is absolute at night. Their flashlights were dying, casting weak yellow beams that only penetrated a few feet into the green wall of vines. They aimed the lights toward the source of the noise, but all they could see were shadows dancing on the leaves. The foliage was moving violently, swaying back and forth as if a storm was localized in that one specific patch of bush. The tension was agonizing. The creature was right there, just behind the curtain of green, separated from them by less than 20 feet of leaves. They could hear the heavy, wet breathing of the beast, distinct from the wind. The smell hit them next. A pungent, musky odor drifted into the clearing, thick and earthy. It smelled like wet fur, fermented fruit, and raw power. It was the undeniable scent of a wild animal, completely different from the sterile or rotting smells of the plants. One of the men whispered, "Leopard," his voice trembling. Leopards are notorious for dragging prey up into trees, and they are one of the few predators that will actively hunt humans if desperate. The thought of being dragged into the dark canopy while their friend lay, dying on the ground, was a nightmare scenario that nearly caused them to break formation and run. But the noise was too loud for a cat. Cats are fluid. They flow around obstacles. This thing was going through them. The breaking of branches reached a crescendo, a chaotic snapping that sounded like gunshots. Then, the vegetation parted. It didn't just move aside. It was shoved open with incredible force. A massive hand, dark and leathery with black fingernails, gripped the trunk of a sapling and bent it effortlessly out of the way. The wood groaned and splintered. The survivors stopped breathing. The beam of the flashlight caught the hand first. It was disturbingly human-like, but twice the size and covered in coarse black hair. A silhouette stepped into the partial moonlight of the clearing, blotting out the stars. It was massive. The sheer width of the shoulders was impossible, a wall of muscle that seemed to absorb the light. It wasn't a quadruped. It was moving on 3 limbs, knuckles driving into the mud, but its posture was somewhat upright. The creature paused, standing perfectly still at the edge of their camp. It was a mountain of a living thing, radiating heat and dominance. The men were frozen, their pitiful sticks lowered, paralyzed by the sheer biological magnificence and terror of what was standing before them. It was a silverback gorilla, a fully mature male, easily weighing over 400 pounds. In the hierarchy of the jungle, this is a king. His chest was broad and silver gray, scarring visible on his flanks from past battles. His head was massive, with a high sagittal crest that anchored the jaw muscles capable of crushing a coconut or a human skull like a grape. He wasn't roaring. He was just breathing, watching them. His dark, intelligent eyes reflected the weak light of the torches, showing no fear, only a deep, penetrating curiosity mixed with irritation. The survivors knew they were in the presence of a titan. Gorillas are generally gentle giants, but a solitary male at night, surprised by humans, that is a dice roll with death. If he felt threatened, he could cover the distance between them in less than 2 seconds. A single swipe of that arm could shatter ribs and collapse lungs. The group lowered their eyes, an instinctive act of submission, trying to make themselves look smaller, less threatening. They held their breath, waiting for the charge, waiting for the roar that would signal the end of their expedition and their lives. But the charge didn't come. The shadow in the woods didn't advance to attack. Instead, the massive animal made a low, grunting sound, a vocalization that didn't sound aggressive, but rather dismissive. He turned his massive head, ignoring the trembling humans, and looked toward a specific cluster of trees to the left of the camp. He wasn't there for them. He was looking for something else. The tension in the air shifted from immediate execution to confusion. Why was an apex powerhouse like this wandering around in the dark, and why did he look? Tired? The shadow had arrived, but the mystery was only deepening. The standoff in the clearing was breathless. The silverback stood less than 15 feet away, a distance that a creature of his power could close in the blink of an eye. The humans remained frozen, muscles locked in terror, expecting the famous bluff charge, the screaming, chest-beating display gorillas used to intimidate threats. They waited for the roar that would shatter their eardrums, but the roar never came. The massive primate simply exhaled, a long, weary sigh that rumbled deep in his chest like a failing engine. He looked at the trembling men, then looked through them as if they were nothing more than ghosts or background vegetation. It was a dismissal so absolute that it was almost insulting. He deemed them neither a threat nor a meal, just an annoyance in his path. He dropped onto all fours, his massive knuckles sinking deep into the mud, and began to move. But the movement wasn't the explosive, dynamic power typical of a dominant male. It was sluggish. Every step looked like a calculated effort, heavy and labored. His head hung low between his massive shoulders, swaying slightly with the rhythm of his gait. The sheer size of him was awe-inspiring. Muscles rippled under the thick black fur, but the energy driving those muscles was clearly depleted. To the untrained eye, he was a monster. To a keen observer, he was a king who was losing a battle against an invisible enemy. Now, we need to pause and analyze this behavior because it is biologically screaming wrong. Gorillas are strictly diurnal animals. They live their lives by the sun. They wake up at dawn, forage, nap, forage again, and build their nest to sleep before dusk. Finding a silverback wandering alone in the pitch black of night is extremely rare. It usually indicates one of two things: extreme displacement due to a rival male or severe physical distress. Pain is a universal insomnia. Just as a toothache keeps you awake at night, internal agony was keeping this titan on his feet when he should have been sleeping. He was breaking his circadian rhythm because his body was in crisis. The survivors watched, their flashlights shaking, as the gorilla bypassed their camp entirely. He wasn't interested in their supplies or their bodies. He was focused with laser-like intensity on a specific cluster of vegetation near the edge of the clearing. It was a dark, gnarled tree, different from the surrounding palms and softwoods. It had a rough, dark bark that looked unappealing and dry. The gorilla sat down heavily at the base of this tree, leaning his back against the trunk as if he needed the support just to stay upright. He closed his eyes for a moment, his face twisting in a grimace that looked terrifyingly human. Seeing a wild animal in a moment of vulnerability creates a strange cognitive dissonance. We are used to seeing them as automated survival machines, devoid of complex suffering. But looking at the silverback, the team saw a reflection of their own situation. Just 10 feet away, their friend Mark was dying on the ground, his body ravaged by toxins. And here, the king of the jungle sat, clutching his stomach, clearly enduring a similar internal war. The species barrier seemed to dissolve in that damp, dark air. They were all just biological organisms trapped in a hostile environment, failing against the chemistry of the Congo. The gorilla opened his eyes and began to work. With a hand the size of a catcher's mitt, he reached up and gripped a thick slab of bark on the tree trunk. The sound of it tearing loose was loud, a dry, ripping noise. He didn't just rip it off randomly, he was selective. He discarded the outer, grayish layer, using his dexterity to get to the moist, fibrous underlayer of the wood. This behavior is fascinating because it defies the standard caloric logic of a gorilla. These animals need massive amounts of energy to maintain their bulk, usually derived from sugary fruits, bamboo shoots, and celery. Bark is low in calories, hard to digest, and usually bitter. Eating it is not a meal, it is a task. The team lowered their sticks. The fear of an attack had evaporated, replaced by a confused curiosity. Why would a starving, sick animal waste energy trying to eat wood? One of the men, the sound guy, nudged the others and pointed. "Look at his mouth," he whispered. The gorilla was pulling his lips back, exposing his formidable canines, but not in aggression. He was salivating heavily. He brought the piece of stripped bark to his nose, sniffing it deeply, checking the chemical signature of the plant. It was a quality control check. He needed to be sure it was the right tree. This specific tree, later identified by botanists, is not part of the regular menu for the great apes. It contains compounds that are astringent and foul-tasting. In a healthy state, a gorilla would walk right past it to find a mango or wild celery, but instinct is a powerful driver. Somewhere in the deep genetic memory of his species, or perhaps learned from his mother decades ago, was the knowledge that this bitter taste was necessary. He wasn't looking for flavor. He was looking for a reaction. He was overriding his taste buds' natural aversion to bitterness because his survival instinct demanded it. The visuals of this moment were striking. The harsh beam of the flashlight illuminated the silverback against the wall of darkness. He looked like a weary philosopher or an old doctor preparing a remedy. He took a small bite of the fibrous wood, chewing slowly. His expression changed, his eyes narrowed, and he made a low, grumbling sound of distaste. He clearly hated the taste. He spat out a chunk of the dry fiber, but kept chewing the pulp, extracting the juices. This was deliberate consumption. He was dosing himself. Meanwhile, behind the humans, Mark let out a terrible, rattling wheeze. His condition was critical. The paralysis was creeping toward his diaphragm. The contrast was brutal. The human was dying because he ate a fruit that looked delicious but was poison. The gorilla was surviving because he was eating wood that looked terrible but was medicine. It was a harsh lesson in the intelligence of nature. The human had used his eyes and his appetite. The animal was using ancient chemical knowledge. The team looked from the dying man to the chewing beast, and a crazy thought began to form in their minds. The gorilla continued to chew, swallowing the bitter juice with visible effort. After a few minutes, he stopped and sat perfectly still, waiting. He seemed to be listening to his own body, waiting for the medicine to hit his stomach lining. The air in the clearing felt charged. The humans were witnessing something that few scientists had ever recorded in the wild: zoopharmacognosy in real time. The Titan wasn't just a brute, he was a chemist, and he held the secret that the humans so desperately needed. As the gorilla took another piece of the bark, peeling it with agonizing slowness, the leader of the human group made a decision. It was risky, it was insane, and it went against every safety protocol they had ever learned. But looking at Mark's blue lips, he knew they had no choice. He looked at the gorilla, then at the tree, and then at his friends. "We need that bark," he whispered. The realization hit them all at once. The cure wasn't in a hospital in Kinshasa. It was in the hands of the monster sitting 10 feet away. The fear of imminent death usually triggers a flight response, but when flight is impossible, the human brain switches to a state of hyperfocus. The group, huddled in the mud, watched the silverback with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The barrier of terror had dissolved, replaced by a strange, quiet intimacy. They were no longer looking at a monster. They were watching a fellow biological entity struggle. The gorilla was less than 10 yards away, illuminated by the dying yellow beam of their last flashlight. Every detail was visible: the rise and fall of his massive chest, the gray hairs mingling with the black, and the almost human-like concentration on his face. He was busy, and his business was clearly urgent. He wasn't eating in the way a gorilla typically eats. Usually, these great apes are voracious consumers, tearing through celery stalks and bamboo shoots with a rhythmic, almost mechanical speed, consuming up to 40 pounds of vegetation a day. But this was different. This was slow. It was surgical. He held the rough, dark strip of plant matter in his hand, inspecting it closely. He used his thumb to peel away a layer of dirt, cleaning it with a precision that seemed learned. He wasn't shoveling food into his mouth to fill a void. He was preparing something specific. The vibe in the clearing wasn't dinner time. It was a medical procedure. He placed the fibrous strip into the side of his mouth, engaging his massive molars. But instead of swallowing, he began to chew rhythmically. his jaw working side to side. Then, he did something that made the narrator gasp. He grimaced. His upper lip curled back, his nose wrinkled, and he let out a sharp, huffing breath through his nostrils. It was the universal, cross-species expression of disgust. Whatever he was chewing was incredibly bitter. In the wild, bitterness is usually a stop sign, a warning of toxicity. Animals are programmed to spit out bitter things. Yet, this titan was forcing himself to keep chewing, overriding millions of years of evolutionary programming. He chewed for a solid 2 minutes, turning the plant matter into a pulp, extracting every drop of moisture from the fibers. Then, he leaned forward and spat the dry, fibrous wad out onto the forest floor. He hadn't swallowed the solid mass. He had only swallowed the juice. He paused, swallowed hard, and then shuddered, shaking his head as if to shake off the foul taste. Then, remarkably, he reached for another piece and started the process all over again. He was extracting an essence. He was juicing the plant. The deliberate nature of the act, the grimace, the extraction, the spitting sent a jolt of realization through the team. Stop. I need you to pause the video right here because we have arrived at the scientific plot twist of this entire story. Up until this point, you might think the gorilla is just eating a bad dinner. He is not. He is engaging in a sophisticated behavior called zoopharmacognosy. The word comes from Greek, zoo, animal, pharma, drug, and nosy, knowing. It literally means animal drug knowledge. This silverback is not dining. He has gone to the pharmacy. He is self-medicating. You see, nature is a chemical battlefield. Plants produce complex compounds called secondary metabolites, alkaloids, terpenes, tannins to stop animals from eating them. These compounds are toxic in high doses. However, in small, controlled doses, these same toxins act as potent medicines. They can kill parasites, neutralize bacteria, or arrest diarrhea. The bitter taste that made the gorilla grimace is the presence of these alkaloids. He knows that the plant tastes bad, but he also knows, through a deep instinctual database, that the bad taste is exactly what his body needs to survive the night. This isn't a fairy tale. This is documented biology. Chimpanzees have been seen swallowing rough leaves whole to physically scrape parasites out of their intestines. Elephants walk miles to find specific clay deposits to neutralize toxins in their diet. And here, in the dark heart of the Congo, this gorilla is using the chemical properties of this specific tree bark to fight a gastrointestinal crisis. He isn't waiting for a vet. He is diagnosing his own symptoms and administering the exact dosage required to fix his internal chemistry. Back in the clearing, the survivors were connecting the dots. The narrator watched the gorilla spit out another wad of fiber. The smell wafting from the plant wasn't fresh or sweet. It was acrid, sharp, and medicinal, like an old apothecary shop. It smelled like chemicals. The narrator looked at Mark, who was now barely breathing, his body limp and pale. Mark was dying because of a chemical imbalance, a neurotoxin. The gorilla was fixing a chemical imbalance using a plant. The parallel was impossible to ignore. "He's not hungry," the guide whispered, his voice cracking with dehydration. "He's sick. He's taking medicine." It was a light bulb moment that pierced through the fog of their exhaustion. They had been looking for water or food, thinking in terms of sustenance. But the jungle had presented them with a doctor. The gorilla was showing them the antidote. If that bitter juice was strong enough to help a 400-pound animal fight off a biological attack, maybe, just maybe, it could interact with the poison coursing through Mark's veins. The gorilla finished his third piece of bark. He sat there for a moment, breathing heavily, his eyes closed. Then, he burped a loud, resonant sound from his deep chest and seemed to relax slightly. The tension in his shoulders dropped. It was working. The medicine was taking effect. The survivors looked at the pile of discarded bark shavings near the gorilla's feet and then at the remaining bark on the tree. It was the only card they had left to play. The realization was terrifying but clear. To save their friend, they had to do exactly what the beast was doing. They had to consume the bitter poison to fight the sweet poison. But there was a problem. To get the medicine, they had to get past the patient. The tree was right next to the silverback. They would have to encroach on the personal space of an apex predator who was currently irritable, sick, and powerful enough to rip them in half. The narrator looked at his hands, shaking with fear and fatigue. He looked at Mark's gray face. The logic of the civilized world had failed them. Technology had failed them. The only thing left was to trust the wisdom of the ape. They had to steal the cure from the king. The observation phase was over. Now they had to take action. The narrator began to crawl forward through the mud, inching toward the titan and the tree. The logic was terrified but sound. Humans and gorillas share approximately 98% of their DNA, our internal machinery, our livers. Our kidneys, our central nervous systems operates on the same fundamental blueprint. If that root was acting as a chemical neutralizer for the silverback, there was a statistical probability it would do the same for Mark. It was a biological Hail Mary. The team wasn't thinking about clinical trials or FDA approval. They were thinking about the fact that Mark's fingernails were turning blue. The oxygen deprivation was entering a critical phase. They had to act now, or they would be carrying a body out of the jungle instead of a friend. The narrator took a breath that tasted of mud and fear and began to crawl. Moving toward an injured, solitary male gorilla is widely considered a suicide mission. Every instinct screamed at him to run the other way. The mud soaked through his pants, cold and gritty. He kept his eyes lowered, avoiding direct eye contact, which is a sign of aggression in primate language. He wasn't trying to challenge the king. He was trying to scavenge from his table. The distance was short, maybe 20 feet, but it felt like miles. The heavy breathing of the gorilla grew louder, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in the narrator's chest. He reached the base of the tree, just a few feet from where the massive animal was sitting. The smell was overpowering musk, wet fur, and the sharp, medicinal scent of the chewed bark. The silverback stopped chewing. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man. The narrator froze, waiting for the blow that would break his neck. He slowly lifted his head. The gorilla was looking down at him. The dark eyes were unreadable, ancient, and tired, but there was no rage. Perhaps the animal understood pain. Perhaps he was just too sick to care. He simply grunted, a low rumble, and turned his head away, effectively granting permission. With trembling hands, the narrator grabbed a piece of the root that the gorilla had torn loose but not yet eaten. It was thick, dark, and covered in dirt. He didn't dare take more. He scrambled backward, crab-walking through the mud, clutching the dirty piece of wood like it was a gold bar. When he reached the safety of the group, he collapsed, gasping for air. But the adrenaline crash had to wait. They had the raw material. Now they had to turn it into a delivery system for a man who couldn't chew. They didn't have a mortar and pestle. They had a rock and a plastic water bottle cap. They placed the fibrous root on a flat stone and began to smash it. The sound of stone hitting plant matter echoed in the quiet camp. They added a few drops of their own saliva, a desperate move to create a paste. The root was tough, resisting their efforts, but slowly it began to break down into a dark, brownish pulp. The smell released was intense, acrid, and incredibly bitter, like pure aspirin mixed with earth. It didn't smell like food. It smelled like chemistry. The preparation was crude, unsterile, and desperate. Under normal circumstances, putting unwashed plant matter into the mouth of an immunocompromised patient is a terrible idea. But the hierarchy of survival dictates that you treat the thing that is killing you fastest. The neurotoxin was the bullet. The bacteria on the root was a problem for later. They scraped the dark pulp into the bottle cap, their fingers stained brown by the tannins. It wasn't much, maybe a tablespoon of extracted sludge, but it was the only hope they had. Now came the hardest part. Mark's jaw was locked tight. The tetanus-like effect of the toxin had caused trismus, a rigid clenching of the masseter muscles. One friend had to use the handle of a survival knife to pry Mark's teeth apart, risking breaking them. The sound of metal on bone was sickening. They managed to create a small gap, just enough to tilt his head back. The narrator positioned the cap over Mark's open mouth and used his finger to push the bitter sludge onto the back of Mark's tongue. Mark didn't swallow. His throat muscles were paralyzed. The sludge just sat there. Panic rose in the group. If he didn't swallow, he might choke on the paste, accelerating his death. They had to manually trigger the reflex. The narrator massaged Mark's throat, stroking downward firmly, begging the autonomic nervous system to kick in. "Swallow, Mark, come on," he whispered aggressively. It was a macabre scene. 3 men in the dark, forcing sludge down the throat of their dying friend, while a 400-pound gorilla watched them from the shadows. Here is the science behind the gamble. They were hoping for a process called competitive antagonism. Many plant toxins bind to specific receptors in the body. The hope was that the alkaloids in this root were stronger, bullier molecules that would rush to those same receptors and kick the poison out, or perhaps bind to the toxin directly in the stomach, neutralizing it like charcoal. They were effectively fighting a chemical fire with a chemical flood. But the line between cure and poison is often just dosage. They had no idea if the amount they gave him was a cure or an overdose. Suddenly, Mark's body convulsed. A wet, hacking cough erupted from his chest. The group jumped back. He gagged, his body trying to reject the bitter taste, but the reflex forced the remaining sludge down his esophagus. It was violent and ugly, but it was movement. It was a reaction. The cough meant that the paralysis in the throat was breaking, even if just for a second. The paste was inside him. Now, the chemicals were racing to enter his bloodstream. The group sat back, their hands covered in mud and plant juice. There was nothing left to do. The gamble had been made. The chips were on the table. They watched Mark's chest, counting the seconds. The jungle around them seemed to lean in, waiting for the verdict. Would the gorilla's pharmacy save a human life? Or had they just sped up the inevitable? The waiting began, and in the silence of the Congo, every second felt like an hour. The 30 minutes following the crude administration of the root paste were the longest of their lives. The group sat in the suffocating darkness, listening to the soundtrack of Mark's ragged breathing. It was a silent vigil, a waiting game against biology. Then, the change began. It wasn't cinematic. He didn't just sit up and ask for breakfast. It was subtle. The violent tremors that had been racking his body slowly subsided into occasional jerking twitches. The rigid, locked tension in his jaw began to slacken. The chemical war inside him was finally turning. The bitter compounds from the root were acting like a biological sponge, binding to the neurotoxins in his stomach before any more could be absorbed into his chaotic bloodstream. The most striking visual change, even in the dark, was the color. Under the weak beam of their dying flashlight, the deathly gray pallor of his skin began to recede, replaced slowly by a faint, sickly pink flush. His heart rate, which had been thready and frantic, slowed down to a sustainable rhythm. Around 3 a.m., his eyes fluttered open. The terrifying, fully dilated black pupils had shrunk back to a more normal size, reacting feebly to the light. He looked at the narrator, confused, terrified, and incredibly weak, and whispered a single word with a cracked voice: thirsty. It was the best sound they had ever heard. It meant his brain was coming back online. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the thick canopy above, the team involuntarily looked toward the specific tree at the edge of the clearing. The silverback was gone. He had vanished silently in the night, his own self-medication presumably successful, leaving behind only stripped bark and massive footprints in the mud. They were alone again, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. They were no longer victims awaiting execution. They were survivors with a second chance. Mark was incredibly weak, like a man recovering from a severe flu, but he could stand, supported heavily by 2 others. They gave him the very last drops of water, a reward for surviving the impossible. They didn't have a map, they didn't have food, but they had hope, which is a potent fuel. They checked the compass one last time, picked a direction that felt right based on the morning sun, and began to walk. The trek out was grueling, a physical torment of deep mud, suffocating heat and tearing thorns, but the psychological weight that had crushed them the day before was gone. They moved with desperate, focused energy. They were dragging their friend back from the edge of the abyss, step by painful step. Around noon, the environment began to shift. The dense, claustrophobic wall of primary forest green began to thin out into scrub brush. The air smelled less like damp rot and more like dust and heat. Then they heard it. It wasn't the roar of a predator or the buzz of insects. It was a rhythmic, mechanical thrumming sound, the beautiful, ugly sound of a diesel engine. They burst through a final thicket of bamboo and stumbled onto a bright red dirt logging road just as a green Congolese park ranger jeep was slowly rolling past on patrol. The sight of the vehicle, man-made and mechanical, brought them to their knees in weeping relief. They waved their shirts frantically, and the jeep slowed to a stop. They were eventually airlifted to a hospital in Kinshasa, treated for severe dehydration, malnutrition, and residual toxin exposure. But they all survived. Mark made a full recovery, though he never ate fruit without a grocery store label again for the rest of his life. The expedition was a failure in terms of filmmaking, but a massive success in terms of biological observation. When botanists later analyzed samples of the root the gorilla was chewing, they found powerful bioactive compounds used in local ethnomedicine to treat severe stomach ailments and neutralize certain poisons. The gorilla wasn't guessing. He knew. This case file teaches us a humbling lesson about our place in the world. We like to think of ourselves as the masters of this planet, armed with technology, data, and science. But in that jungle, human knowledge and human arrogance almost killed 3 men. It was the ancient, instinctual knowledge of a beast that saved them. We are not separate from nature. We are just another species trying to survive in it, and sometimes we are not the smartest ones in the room. The jungle doesn't want to kill you, but it doesn't want to save you either. It just is. It holds the deadliest neurotoxin in a sweet, beautiful fruit and the miraculous cure in a bitter, ugly root right next to each other. The only difference between the grave and survival is knowing where to look and knowing when to shut up and observe the locals. If you want to keep exploring these thin lines between life and death and the secrets biology hides in the dark corners of the world, you know what to do. Click that subscribe button, turn on notifications, join the investigation, because out here, ignorance is the only true toxin. Until next time, stay curious and watch what you eat.